I'm not necessarily I'm sure that there's a lot of different theories and a lot of different ideas about how to educate, and I'm not one to tell educators what to do, but I think it's important to, there's two elements in Jewish education that have to be addressed. I don't know if this means that in every school they're doing it well, they're doing it poorly, they could be doing it better. I'm not sure. That's really going to depend upon the particular educator and institution. But the two areas that need to be a focus, in my personal opinion, when it comes to Jewish education, are the textual skills to create a generation that's able to access text independently, rather than be dependent upon second and third hand presentations of Jewish text. That's a big problem. I think that a big problem is that number one, we spend an inordinate amount of time translating text. It wastes a lot of time. But besides that, it produces very dependent learners. It doesn't produce students or thinkers who can access the content on their own. And instead, they depend upon people who, in translating and commenting on whatever books, are invariably, inserting their own interpretations or their own ideas, rather than allowing the reader to form their own views. So I think that textual skills are a priority for independent learning. And then the second is to teach kids how to think clearly and how to think in a way that is methodical and organized and clear, just to think in a way that's not muddled. And a lot of what happens is that kids come with a hodgepodge of understanding without a clear sense of what's related, how things relate to one another, what is or isn't connected to, let's say, for instance, they won't necessarily know what's in the text, what's in a Midrash, what's in Rashi, and what's in the text. Or
even qualifying those two.
Huh?
Or even qualifying those two.
Right. They
Midrash becomes a text.
Yeah. Or they just have a jumble of different ideas about, let's say, Shabbat, or let's say Kashrut, that they don't cohere into any meaningful, organized understanding of what Judaism is about. So they just get presented a whole bunch of different pieces of information, a whole bunch of different ideas, and are not necessarily shown how these things fit together into a meaningful whole. And that just promotes, I think, fuzzy and disorganized thinking, rather than clear and clear and perceptive thinking. And if we teach the students, one of the biggest challenges we have, I think, in Jewish education, as far as I remember, is when to introduce learning of Gemara in the curriculum. It's always a hot topic, because by definition, the kids who are being taught Gemara are not prepared for it, because the Gemara presupposes an enormous amount of background knowledge. It presupposes that you know the whole Tanakh, and it also presupposes that you know the entire Mishnah, and also presupposes that you know the whole context of the Mishnah. So it just assumes a lot. And since it throws you into a conversation about some detail of some, particular mitzvah that you might not even know what mitzvah it is of the 613 mitzvot that you're learning about, but it throws you into a discussion about a specific law or specific rules, specific details, and the endless back and forth about those details. So you are so focused on the tree, so to speak, that you don't even know there's a forest there when you're learning. And this is the method of Jewish education needs to be more systematic, in the sense that kids are given the foundations of text, the big picture first, before we throw them into the ocean of Talmud. It would be like putting a kid into I often use this analogy to talk about Talmud, that it's putting a child, it's the difference between a graduate seminar for advanced postgraduate, let's say, in a professional setting, such as, let's say, people of either a postdoctoral level learning, or at the very least a doctoral level learning, where you have a graduate seminar, people already know the subject and they're doing research on some specific, highly specific aspect of that subject, and the discussion is endless about the highly specific aspect of the subject, but the framework is presupposed that everyone who walks in the door has a PhD in physics, I have a PhD in biology, whatever it is, and therefore they don't need the foundations and the basic framework to be explained to them. So they can discuss those details endlessly and actually gain something. But for our kids, they learn a half of a page of Gemara over the whole year. They don't even know how it connects to anything else, what the bigger picture is, what the framework is, and what Judaism is about. So the biggest lack is the lack of organization. That what I see is lack of organization and lack of a systematic approach where we introduce them first to Tanakh and they actually know it, and then we introduce them to the mitzvot, really, not even the mishnayot, even though that's what that's what would be thought, because in Pirkei Avot it says, oh, you're supposed to learn Mishnah after Tanakh. But that, like the Rambam explains in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, he says that the Mishnah presupposed a teacher who gave you the whole framework and the whole context. So learning Mishnayot just becomes another disconnected activity. What it needs is really something more like knowing the Tanakh and knowing Judaism the way that the Rambam presents it, which is as a comprehensive system. Then you have an idea of the comprehensive system. So if I talk to you about a particular detail, you know where that detail fits in the system. You know what the relevance of it is. You're not losing your grasp on how things fit together because I'm talking about a detail, because you understand where that detail fits in the bigger picture of things. But if the kids don't even have a bigger picture, they don't have a framework in which to put all the information that you're giving them. So it's like it talks about Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara, with Rabbi Akiva, the way that he learned when he was learning was he would go to different teachers and learn from them. And then he would put, all of the peppers in one basket and all of the bread in one basket. In other words, they use a metaphor. In other words, that he would organize it in these different baskets, meaning you can take all this information in, but you have to then have a meta process of organizing it and systematizing it so that everything fits in its proper place. This piece of information fits into my understanding of this, and this piece of information helps me to better appreciate this. If you don't have that, then you're just under a pile of details that have no clear order and organization. If you ask a child being taught, what is Judaism about? What's it about? What's the purpose? They're not going to know. If you ask an average kid, this Gemara that you're learning, Bava Metzia, whatever, what is the subject chapter of, in one sentence, tell me what is the subject of it? What mitzvah of the 613 mitzvot is being explained in it? And why should I care about it? I just have to pass the test. The kid will. So the idea of having a sense of how it all fits together, the purpose of Judaism, the end game, so to speak, of Judaism, and how the components fit together first, then tell me about the details. Otherwise, you're overwhelming with details, and they never see the forest for the trees. And probably most of these poorly educated, great scientists or whatever, they received the Jewish education maybe even less than that. I mean, I'm talking about a day school education. They probably didn't even receive that, most of them. They just received an even more superficial introduction to the traditions of their ancestors, basically. As even at least in a day school education, there's somewhat it's taken seriously, but not with an eye to systematic exposition and how everything coheres together. And without that, you can't have clear thinking. If you don't know, you can't. That's why the Rambam was so insistent, by the way, in counting the mitzvot. He spends like an entire book. How do you count the mitzvot? What are the 14 rules by which you count the mitzvot? So who cares about counting the mitzvot? Why is it so important to know which are? And he's going on and saying, oh, it's terrible that that previous thinkers have messed this up and they counted the wrong thing. They counted this mitzvah. It's not even a mitzvah. They counted this. It's really just part of another mitzvah. This other thing is just a general statement. It's not a mitzvah at all. Why is it so important? Because muddled thinking starts there. Once you don't have a sense of the big picture, so then you're already starting out handicapped in the process. because you don't even know what mitzvah you're talking about. You could think that you're talking about a mitzvah. You're just talking about a detail of another mitzvah that's much bigger. It would be like if you conduct an entire study on the trunk of an elephant and you don't realize it's part of a larger organism, right? Or if you conducted a study on something that you think are two things and they're really only one thing. So that's why he said you have to start out with that foundation, and it's so important. So the purpose of Judaism is really articulated in Tanakh. The mitzvot of Judaism should integrate with that sense of purpose and should be organized and should be a respectable education in, along the same lines as any other subject matter that would be taught in a comprehensive way, not a hodgepodge. And then you can situate yourself in that framework.
Well, both of us went to yeshiva our whole lives, and then we went to seminary in Israel after the fact. And I felt, especially in my school, I went to Yeshiva University High School, that my rabbi senior year he saw a lot of us weren't inspired by Judaism. And the answer to that is, go to Israel, you'll find inspiration there. And what did I learn there that I didn't learn in yeshiva before? Jewish philosophy, contemplation about like you just talked about, what is our purpose? What are the purpose of the mitzvah? I feel like these are fundamental issues that are completely ignored at a young age. And I feel like maybe even philosophy or understanding Midrash, instead of teaching them like fairy tales, we should be teaching them the way, Aristotle would teach logic, which by the way, used to be part of the curriculum in schools in the world, around the world, and now is no longer. But just learning the depth of Jewish metaphor and allegory, not just as a literal, story, but actually unpacking the deeper message. And I feel like that is just completely ignored. So we go from this fantastical explanation of, let's say, Agadah, Midrash, and then we go from that to Mishnah and Gemara. So I just feel like there's just that gap, like around 5th grade, where you're just completely just thrown into a new world, and it's overwhelming.
It's weird that it was thought that it would be appropriate for kids to learn midrashim that were conversations of like the Chachmei Yisrael about the Tanakh. It's like these statements about that are in the Midrash were conversations among like very advanced learners of the Chumash, and obviously we're not just meant to be then transmitted to children as is. Like it just doesn't make sense that would be thought as that you would transfer one to the other.
It was meant for the intellectual elite.
Right. This was a discussion of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon are talking about something in the Chumash, and you're going to teach that to a kid that they don't understand. They're not on the level of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon to know what it is that really they're trying to get at in their discussion, and what's encoded in that discussion. In the same way that I mentioned before, and I know I maybe beat this analogy to death, but I think this is the best analogy to Gemara and also to Midrash. That if you walked into some conference of scientists talking about some obscure point in a finding in in some research study or some observation that was made of the heavens, and they're discussing it and discussing details of the way that the light was appeared, or the way that you would say, what is this that they're talking about? What's the relevance? Why are they going on and on about this, and what is this about? You would have no idea. Now, to them, this is like the most fundamental. This is going to determine the difference between one theory and another theory of how the universe works. Einstein's theory was confirmed by the bending of light. That they were able to observe. It's like by gravity. So it's like to a person that says, so the light bend, it doesn't bend. Who cares? Why are they obsessing over whether the light's going to bend or not? There's so many more important things to talk about. So in the context of their discussion, that was the most fundamental thing. But for you, who's just starting to learn the area, it's not something you're going to be able to fathom. Like, first of all, what they mean. Second of all, what the significance of it is. And that's the difficulty with introducing. And, it's not just a modern thing. I mean, even the Maharal was very critical of the method of education in his day. Because there's stories about him going and critiquing that the kids memorize Rashi. They don't even know the words of the Chumash. They don't know the psukim. They don't know the simple meaning, and they're already getting ahead of themselves to memorize even more content that's really not intended for their level. And that's the issue. The issue is
but it became the go-to targum replacing onkelos, which I feel like,
Who, Rashi?
yeah, I mean, I feel like that's Rashi a little bit more advanced in a sense where you're dealing with, obviously, somebody say he referred to it as pshuto shel mikra, this is like the simple understanding, but clearly it's not. And
Right.
the method of, onkelos, which was to break things down to a very, rational level. And I feel like that's really missing. Even
Yeah.
our basic
The problem,
understanding of Torah.
what caused people to stop learning onkelos was the language, I think.
Yeah.
That it's in Aramaic and it's very difficult.
I mean, you have to learn a new script to read Rashi also.
It's not that hard, but compared to knowing Aramaic, it's
Right.
not comparable. But the thing is with Rashi that it's there's a simple question you can ask, which is, who was the intended audience of Rashi? Who was he writing for? Was he writing for a second grader? No,
Of course not.
he wasn't writing for them. So yeah, there are a lot of comments in Rashi that are very helpful for Pshuto Shel Mikra. He knew the difference between Pshuto Shel Mikra and not.
Of course.
Many of his comments are helpful and are related to the Pshat and are good. So a good teacher should be able to select the comments of Rashi that are helpful for understanding the text. There's no question that those comments are there, and a lot of them are helpful. The question is when study of Rashi becomes really a study of the Midrashim that Rashi quotes because he thinks that they are an avenue to a deeper understanding of the text for someone who's more advanced. And that is where introducing that to kids can be a problem, because it sends them off the rails of understanding what the actual Chumash says. And for Rashi, that was great. And for the people for whom Rashi intended his comments, that was also great. But it's something that you have to have, again, a context and a background to appreciate. And it will become a liability when it is a distraction from more fundamental work that the person should be doing in their understanding. For sure that kids that get their heads clouded with magical types of midrashim taken literally is a different problem, that they become accustomed to thinking in a way that is not clear, and to thinking in a sort of associative and magical way of thinking that is not healthy for them, and that Rashi wouldn't have wanted them to have either. It's not like Rashi wanted people to walk around in a fairy tale land. He was very selective in the midrashim that he cites.
I feel like it's very hard to shake that off as you're growing up, because you're taught within that prism, and then as you grow, you're never told that, oh, this was meant to be taken, as an allegory and not to be taken seriously. So, how does someone who's an adult now totally go back and reverse everything? It's a problem, because magical thinking, and this is what I feel is one of the problems plaguing, Judaism, in a sense where the intelligent Jews are turned off. Like, I have friends who I convince them after years, just go to a shiur, and they end up going to the shiur of a rabbi who's just speaking nonsense and speaking about magic as if it's real. And he's just like, are you serious? So for me, that's just like, it's a problem. I feel like a lot of people are thinking in those terms, and I think it has to be fixed in the yeshiva, but at a very young age.
Right. I mean, I don't know a simple answer to how to uproot it from your own mind. I remember reading a story about one Rosh Yeshiva that said that he could never learn certain prakim of Talmud, certain chapters of Talmud he could never learn properly because he was taught them as a kid, and he could never get the simplistic understanding fully out of his mind, like the childlike understanding out of his mind. That was him. I don't think it's impossible to do it. It definitely poses a challenge. The only approach is to study the midrashim as an adult with an eye to trying to appreciate what they're really about. If you have that's where a certain measure of emunat chachamim comes in, that if you trust that really the chachamim are chachamim, like the Rambam says, don't believe that they're saying nonsense, you believe that they're really saying chokhmah, then you you have to be a fanatic, actually. You have to fanatically believe that in Emunat Chachamim that they actually had Chokhmah and give them credit for it. And then when you study the words of the rabbis in depth and you have a method for understanding Midrashim, you are always pleasantly surprised. I'm not saying that you're going to understand every Midrash in a short period of time. And you'll definitely have some along the way, what we call tzarich iyun, certain things that don't immediately become illuminated to you, but you'll, like a scientist who at first doesn't believe in a certain theory, but keeps seeing confirmations that, that nature has an order and nature is rational and logical, and it keeps proving itself. So after a while, you become convinced from a few examples, you become convinced of the totality. And that's true also with Midrashim, that once you've seen a number of Midrashim that at first seem bizarre and nonsensical, but eventually you can unpack and reveal as having really shed light on text and having a profound meaning. So you become convinced that the methodology of trusting in the words of the Chachamim and giving them the benefit of the doubt works, because there is a lot of depth there. The key is to teach kids, this story that you heard, when we all have this. I mean, my kids will come with things that they heard, and I try to emphasize to them the fundamentals, like what I'm telling you. I'm just speaking really from myself, that, I emphasize, because it's something that what we call the davar hashaveh l'chol nefesh. Like, every child can get the idea that the purpose of Judaism is to sanctify Hashem's name in the world and to make known that there's one God in the world, and that, through the way that we live our lives, and to understand him as best as we can. And that's what Avraham Avinu pioneered. And if that alone trickles down to your kids, they have a framework for understanding what the real purpose of Judaism is. And they will ask, well, how does this mitzvah relate to that purpose? And how does this mitzvah relate to that? And if they hear a midrash, you say, well, the purpose of this midrash is to highlight this point or highlight that point. And then you quickly move on from the midrash. I don't let them get attached to the material case of the midrash. I'm more interested in showing them the idea of the midrash, so that they know that when they hear a midrash, they should assume that it contains a deep idea, but that they shouldn't get too caught up in the trappings of the midrash, the external trappings of the midrash, but they should realize that the purpose of that was to make it memorable and to attract their curiosity, so that they would see an idea that can help them understand Judaism, and then move on from it, but not make the midrash the focus of the education, because it's supposed to, when they ask a question, you always have to address it, because you don't want them to misunderstand.
So basically, us parents have to step up our game and be able to present midrashim to our children in a more elevated way.
Your kids will benefit from the level of learning that you have. That's for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's always true. And that's true in every area of life. To the extent that you are more knowledgeable, your kids will be able to benefit from having a parent that can answer their questions, or at least can engage them in a discussion that is helpful to them. So when you can show them, when you've learned certain midrashim well, you can say, well, look at this midrash, or look at that, and here's an example of how you unlock a midrash. What do you think this could mean? Just sort of give them as the default the assumption that this midrash is a riddle. It's not really a literal exposition. That's giving credit to the Chachamim, and it's like the Rambam tries to show you that the people who take the words of the Chachamim literally, and therefore believe that Bil'am was floating on a magic carpet and all this kind of things, then they actually are making the Chachamim seem like fools, God forbid. And instead of realizing that these Chachamim had really profound things to tell us, anybody can write, fantastical stories. I don't need a great Chacham like Rabbi Akiva to write some mythical story. I can read the Arabian Nights if I want mythical stories about floating carpets. There's a lot better literature out there for fictional, or mythical details that are
a lot of adults, learned adults who went through yeshiva and everything, believe that rabbis in the Talmud would fly and do all these things. So I've met people like that. I'm sure you've met people like that. It's common.
Yeah,
And
they do teach in yeshiva that like every single one of the Tanaim were able to do Tchiyat HaMetim.
Oh, that's in the Gemara. That's not.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So off
Yeah.
topic. How do you understand
I
that?
didn't make it up.
How do you understand that Gemara? Just while we're at it.
It's look. It's obviously if that were true, then nobody would ever die. So they're trying to make they're trying to make a point about the great the great level of the Chachamim, that they had the great zechut, but it's an exaggeration. We call hyperbole.
Right.
The rabbi spoke b'lashon havai. And what's the example of the Torah? The Torah speaks in Lashon Havai. How do we know that? Because it says that the cities were bitzrot lashamai.
Right.
The wall went to
gets out on the eagle's wings.
right.
It's a form of praise.
Exaggeration. It's saying they were so great that they had the zechut that God would answer their prayers. And what does that really mean about what kind of people they were? That they were really able to. In other words. That leads you to a deeper understanding, because you say, wow, because the initial reaction would be like, wow, they have superpowers, they can raise the dead. But the deeper meaning of that is that they raise the real dead, which is that they teach knowledge to people who are spiritually dead.
Right.
And that's
you reinvigorate the soul.
Right. That's the real zechut. Like the Rambam says in the Moreh Nevuchim, that that real life is a life of the soul. The bodily life is not real life. So whenever it talks about life, that's why we say that tzaddikim, even when they're dead, they're called alive, and the wicked, even when they're alive, they're called dead. Meaning they don't have a real life, they don't have a true life. They have a biological existence. They don't have a human life. So real Tchiyat HaMetim is the person who is able to take a spiritually dead person and bring them to life. That's true Tchiyat HaMetim that they were able to do. So physical Tchiyat HaMetim is not significant from the perspective of Chachamim, because physical life is only an instrument anyway to something higher.